Tendons and ligaments play an important role in stabilizing muscles, joints, and even bones. Okay. Tendons and muscles are tendons and ligaments are dense connective tissues typically, and they have parallel collagen fibers. Fibers going in parallel direction. They stabilize the joint, and they are 60% water, like most cells of the body. 60% water, with the dry content. So if you're to dry the tendon up, like take the powder of it, convert it to powder, 75 or more percent of it will be collagen content. And so collagen is what really gives it that strength, yet elasticity, the ability to bend and stretch, but still resist a lot of force. So what's the difference between tendons and ligaments? Well, tendons connect bone to muscle, whereas ligaments connects bones to bone. So here we're going to look at a bunch of graphs showing the relationship between these things and some of their properties as well. If you look at a stress and strain graph, we can see here a tendon has again a kind of exponential rise to it, and then it falls down before failure, whereas ligaments has more of a steady, exponential kind of increase, and then it would just die off, kind of like the inverse tangential function. This is what you can see here is number one. These are not elastic. If you can see, this is not a linear elastic. This is not a linear elastic response. This is an elastic response. It returns back to normal position, but it's not linear. That means then, depending on the strain, the stress is not proportional. There's no Young's modulus in here that we can use to find E. And this can be explained because the tendons and ligaments are viscoelastic. And we're going to explain that later, what that means. And we're going to see how that viscoelastic property of these two are really, really important in how they perform their function. For tendons, which connect bones to muscles, we can see that after a maximum strain, these tendons are going to reduce their stress, but they're not going to rip entirely. Whereas a ligament, if the joints were, let's say, your knee joints are going to twist to the side, and if it strains too much, what can happen is that the ligaments, after a certain amount of stress, will just fracture there. It's not like it's going to bend and deform, which would be like these regions over here for the tendon, which means that ligaments are a little more unstable than tendons. So look over here. Stress versus time, which means strain is constant. If we were to take a ligament, let's say this length, and then just suddenly stretch it to this length, we stretch it within this time. We're going to assume 0 seconds, ideally, but let's say it takes some time to stretch it. So let's say we stretch in, let's say, 0.01 seconds. Initially, the stretch is going to spike up to a maximum. You're trying to pull these ligaments, trying to rip them apart, tear them apart. So it's going to apply a really high stress. But once you actually stretch them and then keep them there, this ligament will then begin to deform and accept that new dimension, and so it's not going to apply as much stress. So it's like if you're pulling a rubber band apart, you're going to feel that rubber band eventually start becoming with less force. I'm going to start like relaxing into that state and just take that state as is. But it doesn't always go away, and this is because of viscoelastic effect we're going to see later on. It's going to just go down, and it's just gonna stay at this position. It's going to call the stress after infinity. Like, assume time is going to leave it on forever. If you can leave it in that position forever, time goes to infinity. It's going to even out at a point. Same thing with the strain versus time. You can see over here. Strain versus time, again, that means stress is constant. So let's say you have, let me draw another one here. You have a bone here, and suddenly there's a stress. There's a force being applied. You're applying a force to it, and you're going to apply a certain amount of force. Let's say 4 newtons applied constantly. It would always be 4 newtons. Well, then what's going to happen? Initially, this is a time phase before you rise from 0 to 4 newtons. Obviously, it wouldn't stay at, you can't just apply suddenly at 4 newtons. It would, at least there'll be some kind of transition zone. So we're going to call this transition zone. It's going to just go up into this elongation. But then if you keep on holding it at 4 newtons, the internal force here, the internal force will begin to reduce, as we said over here. The internal force will naturally begin to relax. You stretch it, it's going to relax at that position. Well, then when it relaxes at that position, it means it's not resisting that 4 newtons of force. So as the internal stress would decrease, what's going to happen, it will allow that 4 newtons of force to now continue to stretch it, but at a smaller rate. As you can see, it's reaching a point. It's reaching an asymptote. It's going to slowly level off. So it will strain, and then it will strain a little more, and then as you can see, that relaxing effect will occur, so that 4 newtons can have a little more effect on it, until eventually this thing won't relax anymore. It's gonna just say, you know what, this is the stress I'm gonna stop at. I'm not gonna at this much strain. I'm just gonna apply this much stress regardless, and so that 4 newtons of force won't be able to strain it anymore. And again, this is because of physical elastic property. We're gonna have a model of this later on. Okay. Now, if we look at stress versus strain, we're going to see the strain rate, and you can see here there's a little bit dot over here, which means it's like the derivative with respect to time. If we take if we strain it, if the strain rate is infinity, that means that the rate of change with respect to time will be infinite. We're trying to strain it at an instant, as I said right here. If this point is like this instant, like this is going to happen at an instant, suddenly strain it, this is the trend is going to produce stress versus strain. If we were to just slowly, just ever so slowly, that as in this method, just ever so slowly pull it apart, what's going to happen is going to follow this path. And you can see that it can follow any path in between depending on the actual value of strain rate. We're trying to approach these to the extreme ends, infinity and 0. So yeah, if we were to strain it at infinity, we're suddenly going to just spike it up to the point, and then keep it at that point, keep it at this strain. What's going to happen is that if I make sure that the tendon will always have this much strain, that tendon will slowly degrade down into a strain rate of 0. Which means before you supply stress naught, what's going to happen now is, because now I leave the strain as is, it's going to drop down to this position. That's exactly what this one is saying, except instead of having multiple axes, this stress versus time, this is strain versus time, we're combining it all here and creating 2 graphs. And so similar to, as I previously said, strain versus time, which would be this case over here, if I were to apply at a strain of infinite, a strain rate of infinite, so just suddenly apply a force of this much, suddenly apply a force of this amount, is going to be locked at this stress forever. I'm always going to apply the stress. That's the constant, like just like the 4 Newton stress I said. What's going to happen? Well, then it's going to strain initially at this point, because I just did it so fast, but then it's going to slowly just give away, and it will stop at this point. What we can see here is this. Depending on the rate of it, depending on the rate that you apply the stress or strain, a different property will form, and that will be equivalent. A different property would form at a time infinity eventually, and I can form that form at a strain rate by picking a different strain rate. So, if that wasn't that clear, let me just say it one more time. If I produce a strain at a very high number, let's say strain rate of 100 millimeters a second, let's say, then what's going to happen is that eventually it's going to drop down to this position. Well, to begin with, I could have strained it at 1 millimeter a second, and what's going to happen is that it will follow this trend and end up here. So regardless of what strain rate I use, eventually time will put it to its place, back down to this point. Okay, and then quickly here, yeah, so this is going to be the tendons over here. Ligaments also do express this property. After a strain rate of 1.5, we're going to go into the physiological loading zone. Prior to that will be the clinical test. So when you go to clinical test, you try to play with this zone, stretching up to this much, 1.5 millimeter. And then up to 4 millimeter would be physiological loading. At this loading, it's like you're putting stress to it, but really nothing's going to happen. But then after that, microfailure would occur. Microfailure basically means that individual fibers may begin to tear apart. And this is not really good. Entirely, as a whole, it might still produce this kind of increased stress, but individually there may be some of those fibers that are not that strongly bonded to others, which are just going to rip apart. And then we're going to have injury here, very unstable. You can see the instability here is because collagen fibers are ripping, not in order, due to them not being perfectly aligned and perfectly bonded. So we're going to have that point, and then eventually, once they're all ripped apart, it's going to just go down to fracture and then tear apart at 8 millimeter. And we can see here, this is 250 newtons, a load of 250 newtons applied to those ligaments, and a force of 1 k's at this point. So after that, if you apply stress to this much, it's going to cause it to strain this much. And if it strains this much, it's going to fracture really soon. Stress strain, this is literally basic statistics loss. Statistic formulas. Stress is equal to force over area. Strain is equal to the this initial area. Strain is equal to length, final length over the initial length of it. But we can see here, because this is not elastic, notice here, this is not elastic. The formula is not going to be stress is equal to E strain, because it's not elastic. Sorry, it's not linearly elastic. I'll repeat that. It's not linearly elastic. So in this case, then, it is elastic, but it's not linear. So to model it, we have strain is equal to A, E to the B strain minus 1. You can see here. And if we take the derivative of this and solve for the strain rate, we can get the derivative of the stress with respect to strain. The change of stress with respect to the change of strain is a constant times the stress plus C. And C is a product of AB. And if I do examples on this, we'll see how you can solve problems using these two formulas.